Frozen in Fear, a Haunted Library production. My parents had not been seen for days. They were officially listed as missing on Tuesday in the frozen Arctic-like temperatures of Vicksburg, Minnesota. Police still don't know what would possess them to leave the safety and warmth of their secluded cabin in the mountains of Vicksburg. The cabin was found unattended, and nothing was abnormally suspicious about the way it had been left. There was no evidence of a break-in or burglary, and all the cabin's valuables were still in place when the police arrived. Even money that had been left out on a dresser in the cabinet's master bedroom. Robbery was not the motive for the disappearance, and so far, foul play was not suspected because of the way the cabin had been left. I know this because I was the one who was trying to reach them. After 2 days of not being able to reach either of them by cell phone, I feared the worst and finally called the police. I'm their son. I live 3 hours away from Vicksburg, so when the detective from their police department called me back 2 days ago and told me the situation, naturally, I dropped everything and got in my Jeep and drove the trip. It's the middle of January, and the last hour of the trip had especially been difficult. There were times I didn't think my Jeep was going to make it up certain hills. There was about 6 inches of snow here, and the detective had told me to be careful because there was over a foot of snow on the mountain where my parents disappeared. I had a bad feeling the whole trip. The disappearance made no sense. The search for them had been hampered due to the heavy snowfall and wind chill. As of right now, police had suspended the search because of impassable terrain. I arrived at the cabin a little after midnight on Wednesday morning. I had a key, so I let myself inside. Police had turned off the lights. The heat was still on. I searched all the rooms for the next hour, trying to find anything of significance that would indicate what happened to them. Outside, the temperature was 18 degrees, and it always stayed cold up here. So again, nothing made sense. This was the only cabin within miles of anybody, and in these conditions, it was inconceivable that anybody would come kidnap 2 full-grown adults and not take their money and jewelry, which, like the police said, were still in the master bedroom unless somebody had it out for my mom and dad, and money was no significance. After about an hour searching the cabin, I decided to chance the treacherous snow and go out and look for them. The police refused to search, so I was determined to find out what had happened to my parents. They might not be too far away from the cabin for all I knew. I had packed some waterproof snow boots and some heavy clothes for the wind and snow. Me and my Alaskan Husky, Chief, set off just before 2 a.m. I had no clue where I was going or what direction to start in. I decided north. Directly in front of the cabin, the tall pine trees spread out there, leaving a large open path to walk. I would assume if they were to have gone off into the woods, they would have traveled in this direction. And Chief loved this kind of weather. He was dancing around the snow like he was on some sort of walk in the park. But I knew this wasn't no ordinary walk in the park. I also began to feel a heavy, foreboding feeling of being watched as I walked through the shin-high snow. The snow was coming down pretty good, and the wind was just howling. It was cold as hell out here, and I began to wonder if this was a good idea. I knew Chief would survive out here a lot longer than I would if we were to get lost. I had a few cigarette lighters to start a fire, and I was bundled pretty well, so I decided to continue on. I stopped and looked back at the cabin. It was barely visible now in the blinding snowfall. That's when Chief darted off into the woods to my right. I called for him, but he kept going, and this wasn't like him. He had been taught to obey. I pulled the flashlight out of my back pocket and turned it on, its yellow beam lighting up a narrow path through the whiteness of the night. I reluctantly entered the woods and immediately stepped into the deeper snow. I called for Chief again. No answer, just the sound of the snow brushing across my face and my own breathing. I had already worked up a sweat trudging through this thick mess. As I got into the woods, my footsteps became heavy as I navigated blindly through the blackness. I continued to call my dog, but he was nowhere to be seen. I stopped for a few seconds to rest. I was expending a lot of energy trying to walk in this. I listened as the chilling wind whistled around me through the trees. Then I felt the sensation of being watched again. I scanned the trees. My light was not that powerful. It illuminated only about 10 feet in front of me. I was also starting to get cold now, and I felt very uncomfortable. I couldn't just shake the sensation of being watched. I know that sounds cliche. I'd never felt it until that night of actually being watched. And this place was scary. It was densely compacted with trees, and the wind blew the limbs, creating some kind of noise that sounded like lost souls dying off in a snow-whipped landscape. I called out my parents' name and waited. Then I screamed their name. My voice was lost in the storm. Just as I was about to move on, a voice came from behind me. Every fine hair on my body tingled. It had been my mom's voice, calling my name, and her voice was calm, casual, not panicked or distressed, as it should have been in these circumstances. I knew something wasn't right there, but I answered the call anyhow, desperate to find my mom. Then I screamed her name. No answer. Then footsteps began to creep behind me. I was stiff as a board, unable to move, and for some reason the storm calmed all of a sudden. I turned as the footsteps grew closer, yet I didn't see anybody coming at me. Nevertheless, I began to move away from the sound, fearing an unknown, stealthy killer in these woods, most likely the person responsible for my parents' disappearance. Then I heard my mom's voice again, even closer, just as calm. Something was not right. She didn't sound right. I began to run. Then I heard Chief. He was near me, but I couldn't see him either, so I kept running. My mom's voice was now directly behind me. Out of breath, I had no choice but to stop and face whatever menace was doing this. Again, nothing. I bent over, relieved, panting, struggling to catch my breath. Then, in the direction I was running, I looked up and saw my parents. They were both standing together, about 15 feet away as I shined my light on them. My jaw dropped as I saw a hand, a large hand, with long, large fingers that covered both of their faces. This monstrous hand was a dark reddish color with veiny, bony fingers. My dad and mom were both struggling in the grasp of this hand, but it seemed too strong for them to even move. There was nobody behind this hand. My light shined on their face. My dad was shaking and struggling, and even looked like he was shivering. My mom was doing all the same, and her eyes were shut from fear. I could tell she was crying. Despite being scared shitless, my love for my parents propelled me forward. I closed within 5 feet when they were both picked up like feathers and swept away in the darkness of the trees. I saw their bodies fly off into the shadows beyond. This whole movement took about a second, and they were gone, just like that. Beside myself with disbelief, I stopped. I was now hyperventilating. I screamed out again for my parents, realizing that whatever had them had been simply toying with me. I pushed forward again, anger overcoming me. I was no longer fearful. I would stop at nothing to bring them back from this unseen force. After another 30 to 40 yards, I stopped to get my breath. Again, my parents called my name from all around me. I gasped for air, trying to figure out how this could even be possible. Then I saw them again. They were pressed together, and this ginormous hand was over their faces again, squeezing their bodies together. They looked different now, though. They were frozen solid. Their bodies and faces were blue, as if they'd been in the snow and the freezing temperatures for the past 2 nights. Ice covered their eyes. Their mouths were froze open. I screamed, and it turned into a saddening cry. My voice trailed off into the night. Then my flashlight went off. I was now in complete and utter darkness. Tears streamed down my face as I sobbed. I smacked the flashlight, but to no avail. I was stuck in here with some monster that was impossibly fast, seemingly large, and invincible. I didn't know if my parents were dead or alive. If this were the legendary Wendigo creature, it was playing tricks on me, disguising its voice, because that is what they are said to do. I ran as fast as I could without tripping, but I was running around blindly without my lights. It wasn't long before I ran headfirst into a tree. The blow knocked me on my ass and bloodied my lip and nose. I ignored the pain and got back up, desperate to get out of the woods and back out into the open again. After stumbling around in the darkness another 10 minutes, I finally made it out. I had never been so happy to be out of a patch of woods in my whole life. The wind was much stronger out here in the open without the trees to shelter me. I stood and cried. I was exhausted, cold, and terrified. My dog was nowhere in sight. I looked back to where I had exited from. The white of the snow lit up a set of red eyes that were as large as softballs. That's when the storm died down again, just out of nowhere. I couldn't make out a body, but these eyes were placed very tall in the trees. It's like over 7 foot, I would say, maybe even 8 foot. Then I heard the cries of my dad, and the scream of the Wendigo, and the crunching of my dad's bones. I knew he was dead right then. I saw the red glowing circles, which could only be this monster's eyes, move up and down as if he were crunching my dad's bones as he ate. With all the energy I had left in me, I ran for my life. I made it back to the Jeep where I got in and drove. I stopped at the nearest town that I finally had service and called 911. This all happened last year. My parents are still listed as missing. I made a police report, but police don't believe a thing I said. There's no trace of blood, or my parents' clothes, or their whereabouts. It's still a complete mystery. There's no proof of them being in that area of woods that I told police about. All I can think is that the creature somehow lured them outside where they were easy prey. I have night terrors, nightmares. I got plenty of post-traumatic stress and anxiety from this. I am a walking disaster. I miss my parents and my dog. If there's one thing I can tell you, please, never go to an isolated cabin in the middle of nowhere in the winter. Because if people don't get you, the monsters will. Monsters are real. And I'm living proof of this.